You have 3 days to leave my valley, Mr. Langley, or I will stand in that hearing room and destroy everything you have spent 8 months building." Victoria said it quietly. She said it the way a woman speaks when she has already decided and is only informing the other person as a courtesy. Charles Langley stared at his daughter, this woman who had arrived in Montana in silk gloves and burned biscuits, and for the first time in her life, she watched her father not know what to say. She had crossed 2,000 miles to marry a stranger. She had not known she was also riding straight into the war her father had never finished. If you are watching right now, tell me your city in the comments and subscribe, because this story is only getting started. The morning Victoria Langley decided to burn her future, she was wearing a dress that cost more than most families in Montana earned in a season. She stood in the parlor of her father's Boston townhouse, surrounded by oil paintings, heavy draperies, and the particular kind of silence that only exists in houses where disagreement is never permitted to breathe. The breakfast table was set with silver. The coffee was hot. The newspaper had been ironed flat by a servant before it was placed beside her father's plate. Everything in the room said, "You are safe. You are provided for. You are fortunate." Victoria had never felt less like any of those things. Charles Langley sat across from her reading correspondence, through his wire-rimmed spectacles, already dressed for a day of meetings that would further expand his railroad empire and his influence over men who had never once questioned whether Charles Langley deserved that influence. He was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense. He did not shout. He did not strike. He simply occupied rooms in such a way that all other people in them became furniture. Victoria had been furniture her entire life. "Edmund will be here on Saturday," her father said without looking up. "I expect you'll want the blue dress." "I don't particularly want Edmund at all," Victoria answered. Her father turned a page. "That's not a relevant consideration." She waited to feel the familiar collapse in her chest, that particular shrinking that happened when Charles Langley spoke with finality. Instead, she felt something she had no previous name for. Something like a door swinging open in a house she had thought had no exits. She said nothing else at breakfast. But 2 hours later, when her father left for his offices at State Street, Victoria sat down at her writing desk and pulled out a newspaper she had kept folded and hidden inside a French grammar book for 3 weeks. The advertisement was small. It sat in a column between a notice for livestock auction and a request for a schoolteacher in Wyoming. A man in Montana Territory, a cattle rancher, looking for a wife of practical ability and patient temperament. No false promises made, none expected. Hard work guaranteed. The name was Luke Barrett, Black Pine Valley, Montana. Victoria had read it 6 times in 3 weeks without answering it. She read it a 7th time now. There was no poetry in it, no flattery, no carefully constructed appeal to her romantic imagination. The man simply said he needed a partner willing to live plainly and accept that frontier life was not glamorous and might never become so. He enclosed one stiff photograph, a tall man with dark hair, standing beside a horse, squinting slightly into the sun, looking like he would rather be anywhere than in front of a camera. Victoria picked up her pen. She did not overthink the words. She introduced herself honestly. She said she came from a comfortable background, that she understood the work would be unfamiliar to her, but that she was not afraid of learning. She said she was looking for a life that belonged to her rather than to the expectations of other people. She folded the letter, sealed it before she could reconsider, and walked it to the post herself. Then she went back inside and played piano for 2 hours because there was nothing else to do, and because it was the one thing in that house she had genuinely chosen for herself. Charles Langley's reply to Edmund Prescott's Saturday dinner invitation arrived on Thursday. The date was confirmed. The families would dine together. Victoria's future would be discussed over roast duck and good wine, as if Victoria were a parcel being transferred between offices. Victoria received a letter from Montana 6 days later. Luke Barrett's handwriting was plain and direct, much like his advertisement. He said her letter was the most honest he had received. He asked 3 questions. Could she cook? Was she willing to learn tasks she had not been raised for? And was she running toward something or only away from it? Victoria sat with that last question for 2 days. She knew the honest answer was both. She was running away from Edmund Prescott and her father's grip on her future. And she was running toward the vague and terrifying idea that somewhere in the world there was a life she had actually chosen. She wrote back and told him exactly that. Luke's second letter was shorter. It said, "That is an honest answer. Come if you want to. There is no guarantee I'll be what you're hoping for, but I'll be straight with you." That was not romantic. That was not comforting. But it was the first promise any man had made to Victoria Langley that felt like it might actually be true. She bought a train ticket the following Thursday. She packed 2 trunks, one full of practical clothes, one full of books, and left a letter for her father on the parlor table. She walked out of the house before sunrise, before the servants were up, before the city had fully woken, and she did not look back at the street or the door, or the life she had spent 25 years trying to make her own. She told herself she was not afraid. She was absolutely terrified. The journey from Boston to the Montana Territory was 3 days by train and half a day by stagecoach, and by the time Victoria stepped down onto the dusty main street of Black Pine Valley, she had eaten poorly, slept almost not at all, and had entirely reconsidered her decision approximately 40 times. The town was smaller than she had imagined. The street was unpaved. The buildings were wood-framed and plain. A general store, a livery, a small hotel that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite finished. A church at the far end of the street with a crooked steeple. Victoria stood with her 2 trunks and tried to appear as if she had planned this perfectly. He was already there. Luke Barrett was taller than the photograph suggested. He stood beside a horse and a flat wagon, arms crossed, watching her step off the coach with the particular still quality of a man who has spent many years outdoors learning to read weather and animals and situations without reacting before he understood them. He had dark hair under a battered hat, a jaw that had not been shaved recently, and eyes that were a calm measuring gray. He was objectively more handsome than the photograph. He did not smile. He watched her collect herself, the involuntary straightening of her spine, the adjustment of her hat, and then he walked over and lifted her larger trunk without asking permission and placed it in the wagon bed. Victoria said, "You could have waited to be introduced." Luke looked at her. "Luke Barrett, you're Victoria Langley." "Langley, yes." "Long ride." "That," she said carefully, "is your opening question." He picked up the second trunk. "You made it," he said. "That counts." He climbed onto the wagon seat. Victoria stared at the side of his face for a moment, waiting for something, a welcome and explanation. Any signal that this was not the largest mistake she had ever made. Nothing came. He simply waited for her to decide whether she was getting on the wagon. She got on the wagon. They drove 6 miles from the town into the valley through open land that smelled like grass and cold water, and something Victoria had no word for. Something wild and enormous, and completely indifferent to her opinion of it. Luke said nothing for most of the drive. Victoria asked 2 questions about the valley. He answered both in 5 words or fewer. She told herself she was not discouraged. She was extremely discouraged. The ranch came into view as the afternoon light dropped low and turned everything amber. The house was small. That was the first thing she noticed. Not charming small the way certain cottages in the Boston countryside managed to be. Small the way a place is when the man who built it required only what was necessary and could not imagine why anyone would require more. A single main room, a cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, a bedroom through a narrow doorway, no rugs, no curtains, no decorations of any kind, no piano. Victoria stood in the center of the main room and took a very controlled breath. "It's plain," Luke said. He was setting her trunks against the wall. He did not say it apologetically. He said it the way someone states a fact about weather. "I noticed," Victoria said. "I said that in the letter." "You did. Does it change anything?" Victoria looked at the bare walls, at the small window with no covering over it, at the stove that she did not know how to operate. "Ask me in the morning," she said. Luke almost did something with his mouth that might have been under other circumstances a small smile. "There's flour and salt pork. I usually cook myself, but—" He stopped. "Thought you might want to." Victoria had cooked almost nothing in her life. There had always been a cook. Even in the smaller house they had kept when she was young, there had always been someone whose job it was to turn raw ingredients into meals, while Victoria played piano and attended lessons. "Of course," she said. She made biscuits that came out the color of a brick. She made stew that she oversalted so badly that Luke drank 2 glasses of water before he finished the bowl. She sat across from him, waiting for the comment, the criticism, the polite grimace. He ate everything. Then he set his spoon down and said, "Thank you." Victoria stared at him. "It was terrible," she said. "It was." "You don't have to thank me for terrible food." "You made it," Luke said. "First try at a new stove. Thank you." He pushed back from the table, said he would sleep in the barn until they had decided together whether the arrangement was going to become an actual marriage, and told her there was a quilt in the trunk beside the bed. Then he left. Victoria sat alone at the table in the lamplight with her terrible stew and her brick biscuits and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She was 25 years old. She had a degree in music theory and could speak passable French and had read more books than most people she knew. She had just failed at cooking basic food for a man who had barely spoken 20 sentences to her. She was sleeping alone in a cabin in Montana with no curtains and no rugs and no indication that this had been a good idea. She did not cry. She washed the dishes. Then she unpacked one of her books and read until the lamp oil burned low. She woke to thin morning light coming through the uncovered window straight into her eyes. And on the edge of the stove, sitting beside the cast-iron kettle, was a cup. Hot coffee. Already made. Luke was outside. She could hear the particular rhythm of someone moving through early farm work, that purposeful, unhurried sound of a person who has done the same things in the same order so many times that their body does it without requiring instruction. She stood at the window with the coffee and looked out at the frost on the grass and the mountains at the edge of the valley, and thought, in spite of everything, that it was a very beautiful place. He had made her coffee before she woke. He had said nothing about it. She had not thanked him for it yet, and he had not waited around to be thanked. Victoria Langley, who had spent her entire life surrounded by men who performed their generosity loudly and expected to be rewarded for it, stood in a bare kitchen in Montana and drank coffee that a near-silent cowboy had made for her in the dark, and felt for the first time in a very long time like someone had thought about her without needing something in return. It was the smallest possible thing. It was, she realized also, the first thing that felt real. The first 2 weeks were an education in humiliation, and Victoria refused to let it break her. She tore the skirt of her second-best dress on a section of barbed wire fence while trying to close a gate that she had not understood how to work. Luke appeared from across the field, watched her free herself from the wire, and said nothing. He showed her the latch mechanism. Once. Then walked away. She practiced opening and closing it 4 times after he left. She tried to learn to milk the cow. The cow had opinions about this. Victoria ended up sitting on the ground with wet boots and a bruised dignity, while the animal regarded her from a moral height. Luke came to find her 20 minutes later and completed the milking in under 3 minutes without comment. "I want to learn to do that," Victoria said. "Takes time," Luke answered. "Show me again." He did. She tried. The cow shifted. Victoria gritted her teeth and tried again. "Your hands," Luke said. He was not watching her hands. He was looking at the fence line. "You're gripping too hard. Softer. Softer. Like you're trying to hold water without spilling it." It was the longest piece of practical instruction he had offered since her arrival. Victoria adjusted her hands. The cow's ear flicked. Milk came. It was not graceful. It was not efficient. But it happened. Victoria looked up at Luke. He had already turned and was walking back toward the barn. She looked back at the pail. A small victory in a bare, cold morning. She wrote it down in her journal that night, like a medal she had earned. The bread she attempted on the 5th day was dense enough to use as a doorstop. She presented it at supper anyway, sliced it and put it on the table, and watched Luke pick up a piece and chew it with what appeared to be genuine determination. "I can try again tomorrow," she said. "You don't have to." "I want to." He looked at her. That measuring look again, The one she was beginning to understand was not judgment but assessment, as if he were cataloging a piece of information for later use. "All right," he said. Her second loaf was better. Her fourth was something she was actually willing to eat. Her silk gloves, impractical from the first morning, disappeared into the bottom of her trunk. She wore leather work gloves now. They were stiff and ugly and smelled like the shop where Luke had bought them. After a week, her palms blistered inside them. After 2 weeks, the blisters hardened into something that would become calluses if she kept on. She kept on. Luke never once took a tool from her hands because she was struggling. He never sighed behind her when she was slow. He never compared how she worked to how it should have been done. He showed her once. He let her fail. He let her improve. Victoria had been surrounded her entire life by people who helped her in ways designed to remind her that she needed help. Luke helped her in a way that seemed designed to make her eventually not need it. She was not sure whether she admired that or found it maddening. Some days both. But even as the days settled into rhythm and the work began to feel less impossible, Victoria was collecting observations that did not fit. Luke read at night. Every night by lamplight after supper dishes were cleared. He read with the focused attention of a man who reads not for entertainment, but because the information matters to him. She had expected agricultural manuals. She had half expected nothing at all. Instead, she found stacked beside his chair in the corner a thick volume on Western territorial land rights, a Federal Railway Commission report from 2 years prior, a worn copy of Blackstone's commentaries that had clearly been read more than once. She stood in the doorway one evening and looked at the books and then at him. "Those are unusual reading choices for a cattle rancher," she said. Luke turned a page. "Useful ones. Do you study law?" A pause. "I keep informed." She let it go, but she filed it away. Then there was the matter of the water boundary dispute. 2 ranchers, Connell and the Farrow brothers, had been quarreling for the better part of the season over a creek that ran along their shared fence line. The argument had gotten sharp enough that both parties had ridden out to the Barrett ranch to ask Luke his opinion of it, the way people apparently did in this valley when they needed a judgment that wasn't going to cost them a lawyer. Victoria was hanging laundry near enough to hear. Luke listened to both sides of the argument without interrupting. Then he said precisely, and without hesitation, that under the Territorial Water Compact of 1878, a boundary creek was considered riparian property of both adjacent landowners, unless a prior claim of exclusive use had been registered with the Territorial Land Office before that year, and that if the Farrows had not filed such a claim, and he was fairly certain they hadn't, the creek belonged to neither party exclusively. Connell said, "Where in the blue blazes did you learn that?" Luke said, "It's in the compact." "You read the compact." "Doesn't everyone?" They had not. Nobody in Black Pine Valley had read the Territorial Water Compact of 1878, but Luke Barrett quoted it from memory. Victoria watched him from across the yard, a damp shirt still in her hands. The ranchers left satisfied. Luke went back to repairing a harness. Later that evening, when they were both at the table after supper, Victoria said carefully, "You quoted the Water Compact today." Luke kept his eyes on the harness he was still working. "Did I? From memory, precisely. I have a good memory. Most cowboys don't read territorial water compacts." Silence. "Most people don't," he agreed. "Luke." He looked up. "Where did you study?" Victoria asked. His eyes held hers for a moment. Steady. Not evasive exactly. More like a man deciding how much of a door to open. "Long time ago," he said. "Before the ranch." He looked back down at the harness. Victoria understood she had reached a wall. She did not push further. But that night in her journal, she wrote 3 words. "He is hiding something." The evening that shifted everything between them. Not the truth, not yet, but the first real crack in the careful distance they had both been maintaining came 3 weeks after her arrival when Harlan Pierce rode into the yard. Pierce was a cattle buyer. Wide, heavyset with the kind of groomed appearance that suggested someone who spent money on the impression he made. He pulled his horse up at the fence and called out pleasantly enough, Said he was passing through and had heard Barrett had some stock to talk about. Luke walked out to meet him. Victoria was at the window. She saw the exact moment Harlan Pierce saw Luke clearly. Pierce's whole body changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to someone who wasn't looking carefully, but she was looking carefully. His posture straightened by half an inch. His chin came up slightly. He adjusted his grip on his reins. And he said, "Mr. Barrett." Not Luke. Not Barrett. Not the informal cowboy greeting she had heard every other man in the valley use. Mr. Barrett, with something underneath it that was not quite deference and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. Luke's face did not change. "Pierce," he said. Just the last name. Flat. "What do you need?" The conversation that followed was practical cattle prices timing. A proposed sale that went nowhere because Luke named a price, and Pierce seemed to consider it longer than the price warranted before declining. They shook hands. Pierce rode away. Luke came back inside. Victoria said, "He was afraid of you." Luke picked up his hat from the table. He was being polite. "Men who are being polite don't look like they're trying to remember how to breathe," Victoria said. "He called you Mr. Barrett." "That's my name." "Luke." She waited until he looked at her. "Who are you?" He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight was low. Outside, the valley had gone to the deep quiet of a Montana night, nothing but wind and distance, and the occasional sound of the horses settling. Then he said, "A rancher." And he put on his hat and went out to check the horses. Victoria stood in the kitchen alone and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was something like both pressing against the inside of her chest. She did not know yet what she was married to, but she was increasingly certain it was not what it appeared to be. She fell sick 10 days later. Fever. The kind that came fast and hard the way illness did in a valley where the cold moved into a body's weaknesses without mercy. She woke in the night shaking with it, and could not stop shaking, and when morning came, she could not rise. Luke was there. She was not entirely sure through most of it how long he stayed. Hours blurred. She was aware of him cooling her forehead with a damp cloth of broth that appeared when she was conscious enough to want it, of blankets tucked more securely around her when she pushed them away, and then immediately felt cold. Sometime in the second night she woke to his voice. He was reading aloud. She lay still, eyes barely open, and listened to the voice she had expected to hear, stumble over long words or lose the rhythm of complex sentences, and instead heard something else entirely. Confident, clear, precise. The cadence of someone who had read the same text many times, who understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. She recognized the passage. Shakespeare. Not the simple speeches that everyone knew. One of the harder ones from a play she had studied at her music conservatory, because her teacher had believed educated young women ought to know their Shakespeare. Luke Barrett was reading it perfectly. Not like a man sounding out unfamiliar words. Like a man who remembered. Victoria opened her eyes fully. Howe was sitting in the chair beside her bed, the book open in his lap, reading by lamplight in the middle of the night. He had not slept. His shirt was rumpled. His jaw was dark with several days' stubble. He was focused entirely on the page the way she had seen him focused on the water compact and the law books, with that quality of attention that did not belong to a man who had grown up uneducated on the frontier. She said his name. He looked up immediately. "How do you feel?" "Better," she said. "Who taught you to read like that?" Something moved behind his eyes. Something careful. "What do you mean, Luke?" She did not have the strength for anything except the direct question. "You read Shakespeare the way men read who studied Shakespeare. Where were you educated?" The silence stretched. Luke closed the book and set it on the table beside the lamp. "Sleep," he said. "You're still running a fever." "I want an answer, and I want you to get better," he said. "Sleep first." He was not unkind. He was not angry. He was patient in the specific practiced way of someone who has learned how to give nothing away without appearing to be hiding anything. Victoria lay back against the pillow and looked at the ceiling of the small bedroom and thought, there it is again. That wall. Whoever Luke Barrett really was, He had been living behind that wall for a very long time, and he had no intention of opening the door. Not yet. Not until something or someone forced it open. She recovered from the fever on a Thursday morning, and the first thing Victoria did when she was strong enough to stand without the room tilting was walk to the shelf beside the window and look at the books stacked there. She had looked at them before. But looking and seeing are different things, and this time she was seeing. The Shakespeare volume that Luke had read from in the middle of her sickness was sitting on top. Beside it, the law book, the railway report, and underneath those tucked against the wall, as if placed there deliberately out of casual sight. 3 more volumes she had not noticed before. One was a treatise on federal land grants in the Western Territories. Another was a thick volume she recognized immediately, a collection of essays on corporate trust law that she had seen on her father's desk in Boston. The third was a slim leather-bound personal journal with no title on the spine. She did not touch the journal. But she stood there for a long time, thinking about what kind of man owned a book on corporate trust law and kept it half hidden on a shelf in a Montana cattle ranch where the nearest lawyer was 40 miles away. Luke came in from outside to find her standing at the shelf in her housecoat with bare feet on the cold floor. "You're up," he said. "I'm up. You should eat something." "I should," she agreed. "Luke, why do you have a book on corporate trust law?" He set down the bucket he was carrying. He did not look at the shelf. He looked at her. "Careful reading," he said. "That is not an answer." "It's the one I have." Victoria turned around to face him fully. She was still pale from the fever. Her hair was loose. She had none of the composed Boston elegance that she had arrived with, and somewhere in the past weeks she had stopped missing it. She was a woman who could now milk a cow and bake bread that did not break teeth, and she was standing barefoot in a Montana kitchen, having the same conversation she had started 3 times before and never finished. "I'm going to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to understand that I am not asking it to make trouble. I am asking it because I have a right to know who I am living with." Luke was quiet. "Where did you come from before this ranch?" The silence that followed was not the ordinary quiet of a man choosing words. It was the particular silence of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is deciding right now which version of the answer to give. "East," Luke said finally. "East is not a place, it's a direction." "Victoria, don't." Her voice was sharp enough that he stopped. "Don't say my name like it ends the conversation. I am not one of your horses that you can settle with a quiet word and a patient hand. I am your wife, or close enough to it, and I am asking you a direct question." He looked at her for a long moment. "I studied some law," he said. "Before I came here. Long time before." "Where?" Another pause, shorter this time, as if some small door had been conceded. "Harvard," he said. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria stared at him. Luke picked up his bucket again. "You need to eat," he said. "I'll make eggs." "You went to Harvard Law School." "I attended. Didn't finish." He was already at the stove. "Sit down before you fall down. You were running 103 degrees 2 days ago." Victoria sat. Not because she had nothing else to say, but because her legs had reminded her that she had in fact been quite ill, and that standing dramatically in a cold kitchen was perhaps not the most strategically sound position. She watched him crack eggs into a pan with the same quiet efficiency he did everything, and she thought about a young man at Harvard Law School in Boston, and she tried to fit that image against the man standing at her cast-iron stove in a battered flannel shirt, and she could not make the two things sit still side by side. "What happened?" she asked. "Why did you leave D? Family situation," Luke said. "Eat first, then we can talk." "You always say that, because you always try to have important conversations when you haven't eaten." She ate the eggs. They were better than hers. They had always been better than hers, and she had chosen not to comment on it for 3 weeks, because some battles were not worth the energy. Luke sat across from her and drank his coffee and said nothing for the duration of the meal, which was its own kind of answer. The answer of a man who had decided how far to open the door and was now waiting to see what she did with it. "Family situation," she said when the plates were cleared. My father, Luke said. He was in business. Things went badly. I came west. What kind of business? Cattle, rail. A beat. Investments. Victoria set her coffee down. Your father was in the railroad business. Was. And you studied law at Harvard and then came to Montana to run a cattle ranch and read territorial water compacts by lamplight. When you say it that way, it sounds strange. Luke, it is strange. She leaned forward. A Harvard-educated man with a railroad family background who reads federal land grant law for pleasure and quotes territorial water compacts from memory does not simply happen to end up running a modest cattle ranch in the middle of the Montana foothills because things went badly. People who that happens to become lawyers. They go into banking. They marry well and manage the situation. He looked at her steadily. That gray, patient look. I didn't want to manage the situation, he said. Then what did you want? The question seemed to catch him somewhere. He wasn't expecting to be caught. He looked down at his coffee cup. The morning light was coming through the window, and for a moment she could see something on his face that was not the careful, habitual blankness she had come to recognize, something younger, and something tired, and something that had been carrying a weight for a very long time. Something that was mine, he said. Not inherited, not handed to me. Not built on somebody else's decisions and somebody else's money. He paused. Same reason you got on that stagecoach. The silence after that was different from all the previous silences. Victoria sat with it. He was not wrong. And he knew he wasn't wrong, and she knew it too. And for a moment, the kitchen felt like the most honest room either of them had been in for years. All right, she said finally. All right. I'm not finished asking questions, she clarified. But all right. Luke almost smiled. Almost. The right corner of his mouth moved in a way that she was beginning to catalog and understand. She went back to bed for 2 more hours because the eggs and the conversation together had used more energy than she currently had. But before she slept, she lay on her back staring at the ceiling and understood with absolute clarity that she had married a man who was telling her a piece of the truth. Only a piece. And the rest of it was still sitting behind that wall waiting. The days that followed her recovery carried a different texture. Something between them had shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of declarations or soft words. More like a door that had been pushed open a careful inch, and neither of them had reached to close it again. Luke started talking more. Not much more. He was not suddenly a different man, but enough. He would comment on the weather as it affected the cattle. He would explain without being asked why he was riding out to the eastern fence. He asked her once what books she had brought from Boston, and when she listed them, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he had read 2 of them. She asked him which 2. He told her. She said, "What did you think of the second one?" He said, "The ending was dishonest. The writer knew it, but chose it anyway because it was easier." Victoria blinked. That was precisely what she had thought. She had told her music teacher in Boston, who had also read the book, and her teacher had called her response uncharitable and said she was too demanding of fiction. She had never told anyone else because she did not expect anyone else to agree. She did not say that to Luke. But she thought it, and she filed it carefully beside the Shakespeare and the Water Compact and the Harvard Law School, and the growing collection of evidence that the man she had married was not simply hiding a past, but was hiding an entire other version of himself. She built her shelf. That was the week she noticed it. She had mentioned, not complaining just in passing, that she missed having a place to put her books besides stacked on the floor. 3 days later, she came inside from the morning work to find a small shelf installed beside the bedroom window. It was rough wood, nothing like the carved mahogany shelves in her Boston bedroom, but it was level and solid and had been put there because she had mentioned something once, and he had remembered. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she carried her books from the floor and arranged them on the shelf and did not say anything to Luke about it, because something told her that pointing it out would embarrass him in a way that commenting on the eggs had not. Luke noticed her not commenting on it. She could tell because he glanced at the shelf that evening and then immediately looked away in the particular manner of a man who has done something he hopes will not be turned into a larger event than he intended. Victoria understood that language now. The language of a man who showed things instead of saying them. The curtains appeared the following week. She had said nothing about the window. She had simply on 2 consecutive mornings turned her face away from the early light that came through the uncovered glass directly into her eyes while she was still trying to sleep. She had not complained. She had not asked. She came in from the yard one afternoon to find that Luke had hung something over the bedroom window. It was rough burlap, not curtain fabric, not anything remotely decorative. Clearly something he had found in the barn or bought at the general store with zero aesthetic consideration. He had hung it with a rod made from a straight piece of wood and 2 bent nails. One side hung 2 inches lower than the other. Victoria stood in the doorway, looking at the most imperfect curtains she had ever seen in her life, and felt something move in her chest that she was entirely unprepared for. She went out to the yard where Luke was working on a fence post. "You hung curtains," she said. He kept working. "Sun was waking you up. You noticed that. Hard not to. You make a face." Victoria looked at the side of his face, the jaw that had not been shaved in 4 days, the way his hands worked the post with that unhurried economy of motion that was purely him. "One side is lower than the other," she said. "I know. Significantly lower. I know. You couldn't have—" "I can't sew," he said. "And I don't know how curtains are supposed to work. I know they go on a rod, and the rod goes above the window. That's the limit of what I know about curtains." Victoria pressed her lips together to prevent the laugh from escaping, because the laugh felt too large for the moment, and she wasn't sure yet what to do with it. "Thank you," she said instead. He looked up at her then, that direct gray gaze brief and honest. "You're welcome," he said. She went back inside. She looked at the crooked curtains for a long moment. Then she pushed the lower side up a little, which helped only marginally, and left it because it was the thought that mattered, and the thought was the most real thing she had been given in months. She did not fix the curtains. She left them exactly as he had put them. It was 2 days after the curtains that Harlan Pierce came back. This time he rode into the yard in the late morning with 2 other men, not ranch hands, not the traveling through type. These men wore their clothes and their expressions in the manner of men who worked for someone important and wanted you to know it. Pierce himself was more formally dressed than the last visit. He seemed to have arrived with purpose rather than impulse. Victoria was near the barn. Luke was with her, having just finished showing her how to properly store grain so the mice could not reach it. They both heard the horses and turned at the same time. Pierce saw Luke, and again there it was, that same subtle shift in his whole bearing, the infinitesimal straightening, the controlled expression of a man managing his reaction to something that surprised him. "Mr. Barrett," Pierce said. "Didn't expect to find you here." "It's my ranch," Luke said. "Where else would I be?" A small pause. Pierce looked at Victoria. "Ma'am." Then back to Luke. "Wondered if we might speak privately." "My wife's not going anywhere," Luke said. The words were quiet and entirely final, and Pierce clearly understood both things. He dismounted. The 2 men behind him stayed on their horses. Pierce walked to the fence and Luke went to meet him, and Victoria stayed where she was, but close enough to hear. "There's talk," Pierce said, keeping his voice down, even though the effort seemed unnecessary, given the distance. "About a rail spur, coming through the valley. Early stages, nothing announced, but people are positioning." Luke said nothing. "Land around the water corridor is going to be worth 10 times what it's worth now if the spur comes through where I think it will." Pierce's voice had a careful quality, like he was laying cards face down on a table. "There are buyers already." "Who?" Luke said. "Eastern money, investment types. They're buying through proxies so the prices don't jump before they've secured what they need." "And you're telling me this because—" Pierce glanced at the 2 men behind him. "Because you're sitting on the water corridor, Mr. Barrett. Your land. And whichever way this goes, I thought you ought to know what you're sitting on." Luke was quiet for a long moment. "Appreciate that," he said finally. Pierce nodded once, put his hat back on. "I'd be careful who you talk to about this." He glanced very briefly at Victoria, then back at Luke. "And I'd be careful who you trust." He remounted and rode out. Victoria came to stand beside Luke. They watched the 3 men ride back toward the main valley road. "He's afraid of you," Victoria said again. He's warning me. He's doing both. She paused. Eastern money buying land through proxies before a rail announcement goes public. That's what my father does. Luke turned his head to look at her. What? She said. You know what that is. I grew up listening to my father have dinner with men who built their fortunes on exactly that practice, Victoria said. Buy the land quietly, announce the railway, sell at the new price, or keep it and collect from everyone who needs access. It's... She stopped. It's not new. No, Luke said. It's not. Luke. She looked at him directly. Is this valley in trouble? He held her gaze, something working behind his eyes that she still did not have the full vocabulary to read. Not yet, he said. But possibly. Possibly. And you? She stopped because a thought was forming and she wanted to be precise about it. You know something about this, about how it works. From before. From Victoria. Don't stop me. You have a law education. Your father was in the cattle and rail business. You understand land purchases and proxy companies and how the money moves because you have seen it from the inside. She kept her voice level. And Harlan Pierce rides into this yard and calls you Mr. Barrett, like you're someone he owes deference to. Why? Luke looked at the road where Pierce had gone. Old acquaintance, he said. How old? Long time ago. Luke. He turned back to her. And this time the wall was visible. She could almost see the exact place where he had decided some years ago to build it and why. It was not dishonesty exactly. It was the wall of a man who had learned that some truths when spoken change everything, and who had decided it was safer for everyone if certain things remained unspoken. She understood that more than she wanted to. She had built walls too. In Boston. Different walls, different reasons, same fundamental architecture. When you're ready to tell me the whole of it, she said quietly, I'll listen. She went back inside, and Luke stood in the yard alone for a long time before he followed her in. That night, he came to the table with a piece of paper and set it down in front of her. It was a deed, a section of the ranch, the eastern portion, the one that bordered the creek valley that Pierce had described as the water corridor. This is the land he was talking about, Luke said. If the spur goes where the current surveys suggest, whoever owns this section controls access to water for the whole construction run. Victoria looked at the deed, then at him. And you own it, she said. I do. What are you going to do? He sat down across from her. I don't know yet, but I'm not selling it to whoever Pierce is working for. Why not? The money must be. Because if they get the water corridor, every small rancher in this valley loses their bargaining position with the rail buyers. He said it simply, not dramatically, as fact. They control the freight prices. They control who ships and who doesn't. You own the water, you own the valley. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. You came here to get away from exactly this kind of fight, she said. I know. And now it followed you. Seems like, Luke said. She looked at the deed. Then at the man across the table who was not she, understood clearly now anything close to what she had imagined when she answered his advertisement. He was not the simple, plain-spoken cowboy who wanted an equally simple partnership. He was something far more complicated, and she still did not have all the pieces. And the pieces she did have were beginning to form a picture that made the back of her neck prickle. She had fled Boston to escape powerful men and their private games. She had landed in a Montana kitchen across from a man who was, by everything she now knew, entirely capable of playing those games himself, and who had chosen, for reasons she still could not entirely fathom, not to. She asked the question that had been building for weeks. Luke, are you actually who you say you are? The silence was the longest one he had given her yet. When he finally answered, his voice was quiet and entirely even. I'm Luke Barrett, he said. I own this ranch. I run it myself. Everything you see here is real. He paused. But no, that's not all of it. Victoria did not move, did not look away. Then what, she said, is the rest of it? He stood up. He walked to the window where the crooked curtains hung uneven and imperfect over the glass. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned around. He opened his mouth, and then hooves hit the yard. Fast, urgent, someone riding hard. Luke's head turned sharply toward the sound. Victoria was on her feet before she realized she'd stood. Outside, a horse skidded to a stop, and they heard a man's voice, breathless and high with something close to panic. Barrett, you need to come. The Connell fence line, somebody pulled the stakes on the creek boundary. All of them, tonight. Luke was already moving for his coat and hat. Victoria caught his arm. We are not finished with this conversation, she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight, with the sound of a frightened neighbor outside, and whatever truth he had been about to offer, still sitting unsaid in the space between them. Luke Barrett looked at his wife, and for the first time since she had arrived in Montana, she saw something on his face that was not the careful blankness, not the patient wall. It was something that looked like a man who had run out of room. I know, he said. Then he went out into the dark. And Victoria stood alone in the kitchen with the crooked curtains, and the deed on the table, and the cold, settled certainty that whatever was coming for this valley and for the man she had married was already closer than either of them had admitted. Luke did not come back until well past midnight. Victoria heard the horse before she heard him, the particular sound of an animal that had been ridden hard and was glad to be home. She was still at the table. She had not meant to stay awake. She had told herself she would read, and then she had sat with the book open and unread in front of her for 2 hours, while the lamp burned and the valley went completely dark and silent outside. She heard his boots on the step. The door opened. He looked at her across the room. This woman who was supposed to be asleep, sitting straight-backed at the table with a closed book, and an expression that told him she had been thinking hard for the duration of his absence, and he pulled off his hat and hung it on the peg by the door. Creek stakes were pulled by someone who knew what they were doing, he said. Not random, deliberate. To cause trouble between Connell and the Pharaohs, or to give someone a reason to ride into the valley and offer to settle the dispute, for a fee or a deed. He sat down across from her. He was tired. She could see it in the way he held his shoulders slightly lower than usual, the particular weight of a man who had spent the last 3 hours managing other people's fear as well as his own. Victoria folded her hands on the table. You were going to tell me something, she said. Before Connell's man came. Luke looked at his hands. I was. Are you going to tell me now? The silence had a different quality than all the ones before it. All the previous silences had been walls. This one felt more like a door that had been standing locked for a long time, and somewhere in the night the key had finally been turned. He did not look up immediately. When he did, his eyes were direct and steady, in the way of someone who has decided that the cost of honesty, whatever it turns out to be, is lower than the cost of continuing to carry something alone. My full name, he said, is Lucas Barrett Whitmore. The name meant nothing to Victoria for exactly 3 seconds. Then it meant everything. Whitmore. She knew that name. She had grown up knowing that name. Her father had spoken it at dinner tables and in parlors, and in the particular clipped tone he reserved for business rivalries that had not resolved in his favor. Jonathan Whitmore. The Whitmore cattle and rail interests. The Western land holdings. The man who had been her father's partner, and then his opponent, and then some years ago his enemy. She said very carefully, Jonathan Whitmore's son. Yes. The word fell between them, like something heavy being set down on a table. Victoria did not move. She was working through it the way she worked through complicated things, methodically feeling each piece before she placed it, because placing it wrong would mean having to pick it back up, and she did not have the patience for that tonight. Jonathan Whitmore. Partner to Charles Langley in the transcontinental northern expansion. The partnership that had made her father's fortune and then collapsed in accusations and legal threats that her father had always described when pressed as a misunderstanding that got out of hand. The man who had accused Charles Langley of manipulating land purchases along proposed rail routes for personal profit, who had died of illness 2 years after the partnership dissolved, whose son had apparently walked away from everything and disappeared west. Lucas Whitmore, sitting across from her in a flannel shirt with stubble on his jaw and tired eyes. Her husband. You knew who I was, Victoria said. When I wrote to you. Luke did not flinch. Yes. That was what hurt. Not the name, not the history. The yes. She stood up from the table. Not with any particular destination. She simply needed to be upright because the weight of what he had just said required more than sitting down to carry it. You recognized my name, she said. Victoria Langley, Charles Langley's daughter. Yes. And you answered my letter anyway. Yes. Why? Her voice was level. She was working very hard to keep it level because the part of her that was not working hard at all was furious, and she had learned from long experience in her father's house that anger without control was only ever ammunition for the person you were angry at. If you knew who I was, if you knew whose daughter I was, why didn't you refuse the letter? Why bring me here? Luke stood. He did not reach toward her. He stayed where he was, and she understood that he was doing it deliberately, giving her the space to be angry, not closing the distance in a way that would feel like management. I saw you once, he said. In Boston, before I left. A charity dinner for the Rail Workers Relief Fund. You were 17, maybe 18. Victoria stared at him. There was a widow, Luke continued. Her husband had died on a construction crew, fell from a bridge trestle. The fund administrators had denied her compensation because of some clause about worker negligence. Your father was on the board. He was speaking, and all the right people were nodding, and nobody was going to say anything. Victoria was very still, and you stood up, Luke said. In the middle of that room, in front of all those men in their good suits. And you said I remember this clearly because I was standing near the back, and I wasn't expecting it. You said that denying a widow who had lost her livelihood along with her husband was not a legal decision. It was a moral failure, and that the men in the room had confused the two. He stopped. Your father told you to sit down. I remember, Victoria said quietly. You didn't. She said nothing. I left Boston 3 months later, Luke said. But I remembered you, not because you were beautiful though you were, because you were in that room and you could not keep quiet when something wrong was happening, even when everyone in the room had the power to make your life difficult for saying it. He paused. When your letter came, I recognized the name. I sat with it for a week. I told myself to refuse it. I told myself it was complicated, and that the history between our families made it impossible, and that nothing good could come of it. But you answered anyway. Because, he said, and his voice was very quiet now, a woman desperate enough to cross 2,000 miles to get away from a life she didn't choose deserved the chance to choose differently. Even if the choice she was making had complications she didn't know about yet. Victoria turned and looked at him. That, she said, is either the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most arrogant. I haven't decided which. Probably both, Luke said. You gave me a choice while hiding the one fact that might have changed it. Her voice was steady and hard. I had a right to know whose name I was writing to. I had a right to decide for myself whether the history between our families was something I could or couldn't live with. You took that from me. I did, he said. He did not argue it, did not qualify it. I was wrong. The admission landed differently than she expected. She had braced herself for justification for the careful reframing of a man who had made a decision on someone else's behalf and wanted credit for his intentions. Instead, he simply confirmed what she had said and looked at her without asking her to forgive him for it. She walked to the window. The crooked curtain hung in the dark. She pushed it aside and looked at nothing. Just the black Montana night, because she needed somewhere for her eyes to go while she sorted through everything her mind was doing. Lucas Whitmore, Harvard Law. His father's business in cattle and rail. His father's accusation against Charles Langley. The land purchases. The corruption that her father had denied and Luke's father had died still believing in. And now a rail spur coming through Black Pine Valley. And Eastern money buying land through proxies. And Harlan Pierce riding into this yard with his careful warning and his deferential Mr. Barrett. She turned around. Pierce, she said. He knew you as Whitmore. He worked for my father. Does he know what's happening in this valley with the land purchases? He knows enough to warn me, which means he's afraid whoever is buying is going to get what they want, and he wants to be on the right side of it when it shakes out. Who is buying the land, Luke? The pause. I don't know yet, he said. But I have a guess. She looked at him. The guess sat between them unspoken, and she could see it in his face, and she did not want to name it, because naming it would make it a different kind of problem than the one she was already holding. Tell me, she said. Your father, Luke said, or someone working through him. Victoria closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. How long have you suspected? Since Pierce's first visit, when he described the buyers as Eastern money moving through proxies. He watched her face. I'm sorry. Don't. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Don't be sorry for the fact. Be honest about it. I am being honest about it. Then be honest about this too. She crossed back to the table and stood across from him. If my father is buying land in this valley, he didn't come here blindly. He has people who gather information. He would know about the water corridor. He would know who owns it. She paused. He would know about you. Luke said nothing. Luke, does my father know you're here? Does he know you're Lucas Whitmore? The silence was its own answer. He knows, Victoria said. Likely, Luke said. Yes, she sat down. Not from weakness. From the necessity of being level and grounded for the next part of what she was going to say. Then my coming here, she said slowly, working through it as she spoke. My letter, my father finding out where I went. She stopped. He wasn't only coming to bring me home, was he? Luke said nothing. I was coming for the land, Victoria said. He just needed a reason to arrive in person, and I handed it to him. She laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the sound of something clicking into place that she would have preferred to leave unassembled. His runaway daughter. The perfect excuse to ride into Black Pine Valley with lawyers and hired men without anyone questioning why Charles Langley is suddenly so interested in a small cattle community in Montana. Victoria, I am not finished. Her voice was iron steady. You knew this was possible when you answered my letter. You understood that our family's history made my arriving here a complication. You saw it coming and you said nothing. I didn't know for certain. But you considered it. The quiet told her everything. You considered it, she said again. Not accusing now, just stating it because she needed to hear herself say the true thing clearly. And you decided that the chance of it was worth the risk because you believed... She stopped. What did you believe, Luke? That it wouldn't matter, that you'd protect me from it. That you'd handle my father, the way you handled the creek disputes and the water compacts and everything else. You quietly managed from behind a wall of anonymity. I believed, Luke said, and his voice was different now, not defensive, not guarded, something rawer than that whatever happened, you deserved to be somewhere you had chosen, not somewhere you had been placed. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. The lamp was low. Outside the valley was silent and enormous and indifferent. Pack a bag, she said. Luke went very still. I need to think, Victoria said. And I cannot think inside this house right now. She stood. I'm going to sleep at the Connell place tonight. Mrs. Connell offered weeks ago. I'm going to take her up on it. Victoria, I'll be back tomorrow. She said it firmly. Not to reassure him, but because it was true, and she wanted him to know it was true, because she was not her father's daughter, in the way of people who disappeared when things became difficult. She picked up her coat from the peg. I am not running, she said. I am thinking. There is a difference. Luke stood and said nothing, which was exactly right. She walked out. He let her go. She came back the next morning at dawn the way she said she would. She had not slept much. Mrs. Connell, a sensible woman in her 50s, who had been making ranching work for 30 years, had given her coffee and a bed, and asked no questions, and offered no opinions, which was precisely what Victoria needed. She lay awake most of the night, not crying, not catastrophizing, but thinking with the same practical, thorough attention she had given to learning to milk a cow and bake bread, because this was simply the next thing that needed to be understood and managed. By 4 in the morning she had worked through the worst of the anger. Not all of it, but enough. By 5, she understood what she was actually angry about, which was different from what she had told Luke. She was not angry that Luke had come from a wealthy family. She was not angry that his father and hers had been enemies. She was not even at the bottom of it angry that he had hidden his identity, though she had a right to be, and was not entirely done with that part yet. She was angry because for the first time in her life, she had made a choice that felt genuinely hers, and she had discovered that the choice had been shaped quietly, carefully, with the best of intentions by someone else's calculations. That was the thing she recognized. That was the thing she could not sit still with. Because it was exactly what her father did. Different reasons, different outcome. But the same fundamental act deciding on her behalf what she was ready to know. She rode back to the ranch in the early morning light, and found Luke already working, because Luke was always already working, which was one of the most reliably true things about him. He looked up when she rode in. He did not look relieved. He looked like a man who had spent the night waiting for a verdict and was prepared to accept it either way. She tied the horse. She walked to where he was. "I understand why you answered my letter," she said. "I even understand why you didn't tell me who you were when I arrived. You thought the truth would make me leave before I had the chance to find out whether this was real." She paused. "You were probably right." He said nothing. "But I'm not a decision you get to make," she said. "You don't get to weigh my readiness. You don't get to calculate what I can handle. That is what my father does. I came 2,000 miles to get away from men who decided things on my behalf, and I will not have it here, Luke. I will not have it from you." "That's fair," he said. "I'm not done." He waited. "When my father comes." She stopped. "And he will come. You know he will come. When he does, I want to know everything before he arrives. Every piece of the history between your family and mine. Every legal detail about the water corridor. Everything you know about the land purchases. All of it." She met his eyes directly. "No more walls. No more half-answers. If we are going to face whatever is coming, we do it as two people who are telling each other the truth. Can you do that?" Luke looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face, through the careful, habitual stillness of it. Something that was not relief exactly, but was the particular quality of attention that has been held for a very long time, finally finding permission to let go. "Yes," he said. "Good." She walked inside. He followed her. For the next hour, sitting at the kitchen table, with the morning light coming through the crooked curtains, Luke Barrett, Lucas Whitmore, told her everything. His father, Jonathan, had built the Whitmore cattle interests from Montana land into a regional empire over 20 years. When Charles Langley approached him about a joint venture on a northern rail expansion, Jonathan had seen it as a natural extension. The cattle needed the rails, and the rails needed the cattle lands. They had been partners for 3 years. Then Jonathan had discovered something in the shared accounts. Land purchases being made along proposed route corridors before the route announcements were filed publicly. Properties that appeared in the company books as joint acquisitions, but whose deeds, when Jonathan's lawyers examined them, showed beneficial ownership routed through companies that belonged exclusively to Charles Langley. He had confronted Charles directly. Charles had accused him of misunderstanding the accounting. Jonathan had gone to the Territorial Land Office. The records had been amended by the time his lawyers arrived, not eliminated. Amended. Carefully, precisely, with the skill of someone who knew exactly what trail to obscure while leaving enough paper behind to suggest the original arrangement was legitimate. Jonathan could not prove what he knew. He spent 2 years trying. It cost him clients' relationships, legal fees, and eventually his health. He died without winning. His son watched it happen from Boston, from a Harvard Law lecture hall, from the particular impotent distance of someone who understands exactly what is being done and cannot find the lever that will stop it. Luke had come to Black Pine Valley 3 years after his father's death. He had sold most of the Whitmore holdings enough to make the sale uninteresting to anyone watching, small enough that it didn't look like retreat. He kept this land, the water corridor land. The one piece of the valley that he knew from his father's surveys sat at the center of any viable northern rail expansion in the territory. He had not kept it to fight. He had kept it because letting go of it would have felt like letting go of the last thing his father had known mattered. When Victoria finished listening, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "My father is going to come here to buy that land." "Yes. And when he finds you here—" "He already knows I'm here," Luke said. "Has to. He's been buying the surrounding parcels. He's been setting up the corridor," Victoria said. "Buying everything around your land to make it worthless to hold unless you sell. And then offering to buy at whatever price he names because you have no other option." She stopped. "That's exactly how he handled the Mercer timber dispute in '43. I was 16, and I heard him describe it at dinner like it was clever." She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked at the valley she had been living in for weeks now, the valley she had learned to read, the way she had learned to read the stove and the soil and the particular silences of the man she had married. "He is not going to get it," she said. Luke looked at her back. "Victoria, he is not going to get it." She turned around. "Not because of your father, not because of history, because this valley belongs to the people who live in it, and my father has taken enough things from enough people, and he does not get to do it here." Luke was very still. "You sound like you have a plan," he said. "I'm working on one." She crossed back to the table and sat down. "Tell me every name of every parcel that's been sold in the last 6 months. Every deed transfer, every new owner, every proxy company name if you know them." "That's a lot of information." "Good thing I know how to read a land record," Victoria said. "My father taught me. He thought it was useful for a woman to understand how property moved so she could advise her husband intelligently." She met Luke's eyes. He did not anticipate this specific situation. Luke looked at her, this woman who had arrived in Montana in a ruined silk dress and burned his biscuits and fallen backward with a water bucket and blistered her palms and learned to read the land beneath her feet. And something moved across his face that was not the careful, managed stillness she had spent weeks learning to interpret. It was something she had not seen there before. Something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of awe. The private railroad car appeared in Black Pine 6 days later. Victoria saw it first. She had gone into town for supplies because ordinary life continued even in the shadow of coming disaster. And she was at the general store when she heard the train and went to the window and saw the car sitting on the siding. Private. Mahogany paneling visible through the window glass. The kind of car that announced its owner's wealth the way a flag announced a country. Her stomach dropped straight through the floor. She was at the counter when the door opened behind her. She turned around. Her father walked in. Charles Langley had aged in the months since she had left Boston. Or perhaps she was only seeing him differently now through the eyes of a woman who had spent 2 months in a Montana winter, learning exactly how much physical reality it took to keep a life running, versus the eyes of a daughter who had never been permitted to see her father as simply a man who made choices. He was wearing a traveling coat and his wire-rimmed spectacles, and the particular expression he always wore when entering a room he intended to control. Behind him came 2 lawyers, and behind them, Edmund Prescott. Edmund had not aged. Edmund was exactly the same as he had always been. Polished, pleasant-faced, perfectly dressed, and empty in the particular way of men who had never been required to be anything other than the sum of their family's money. He looked at Victoria and said, "My goodness, Victoria, you look—" "Don't," she said. Charles Langley looked at his daughter across the counter of a general store in Montana and did not embrace her. He assessed her the way he assessed contracts. "You look well," he said, "considering." "I am well," Victoria said. "Considering nothing. We need to speak privately. We can speak here." "Victoria, whatever you intend to say to me, father, you can say it in a room where other people are present." She set her purchases on the counter. "I learned that from you, actually. Never negotiate without witnesses." Charles Langley was not a man who showed surprise easily. But something moved through his expression at that. He said, "I came for you." "You came for the water corridor," Victoria said. "And you used me as the reason." The store had gone very quiet. The storekeeper was pretending to inventory a shelf he had already inventoried. Charles took a breath. "Is there somewhere we can speak that is not—" "The ranch," Victoria said. "You can come to the ranch, but I want you to understand something before we go there." She picked up her bag. "Luke knows you're coming, and I know everything, Father. I know about the proxy purchases. I know about the corridor land. I know about Jonathan Whitmore." She met his eyes. "And I know what you did to him." Charles Langley went very still. Edmund said from behind him, "Now look here." "Edmund," Victoria said pleasantly, "no one was addressing you." She walked out. Behind her, in the quiet of the general store, she heard her father say nothing. The silence of a man who has just discovered that the piece he thought he controlled has moved on its own. She rode back to the ranch and told Luke that her father was in Black Pine. Luke already knew. Word moved fast in a small valley. He was standing at the fence when she rode in, and he looked at her face and he said, "How did he look?" "Surprised," Victoria said. "Which is good. My father makes his worst decisions when he's surprised. He'll recover." "I know. We need to be faster than his recovery." She dismounted. "He's coming here, today. He'll bring lawyers and Edmund and whatever hired men he has on that car." "I'll be here." "I know you'll be here." She looked at him steadily. "Luke, when he arrives and he sees you, when he sees Lucas Whitmore standing in this yard, what happens?" Luke was quiet for a moment. He looked at the gate, at the valley, at the mountains behind all of it. "He'll try to use our history," he said. "He'll say I brought you here to manipulate him. That the whole arrangement was designed to—" "I know," Victoria said. "He'll try to make me doubt you." "Will it work?" She looked at him. This man who had read Shakespeare in the middle of the night to keep a sick woman company. Who had built a shelf from rough wood because she mentioned needing one. Who had hung crooked curtains and said, "I know they're crooked," and hadn't apologized for it, only offered the honest explanation that this was the limit of what he knew about curtains. Who had told her the truth last night finally and completely. Not because it was convenient, but because she had asked him to stop carrying it alone. "No," she said. He nodded once. They waited. The sound of multiple horses came into the yard an hour later. Luke was standing on the porch. Victoria was standing beside him. Charles Langley dismounted and walked toward them, and the very moment his eyes landed on Luke, he stopped walking. His face went through something. Not surprise. Recognition. The specific cold recognition of a man who has been planning for a contingency and has just discovered the contingency is standing on a porch in Black Pine Valley, looking back at him without flinching. He said, "Lucas." Luke said, "Mr. Langley." Then Charles Langley looked at his daughter, and Victoria looked back at her father with the eyes of a woman who had crossed 2,000 miles and learned to milk a cow and read a land deed and choose her own life, and she said very quietly, "Hello, Father." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a storm, and every person standing in that yard knew it. Charles Langley had not survived 40 years in business by letting silence work against him. He recovered within seconds. That was the thing about her father, that Victoria had always both admired and feared his ability to absorb a shock and immediately begin repurposing it. He looked at Luke on that porch, looked at his daughter beside him, and then he did something she did not expect. He smiled. "Well," Charles said, "this is a surprise." "Is it?" Victoria said. "Lucas Whitmore running a cattle ranch in Black Pine Valley." He said it with the tone of a man commenting on mildly interesting weather. "Your father would have found that deeply ironic." Luke said nothing. Victoria felt him go very still beside her. Not tense exactly, but the particular stillness of someone who has decided that the first person to react loses ground. "Come inside," Victoria said, "since you've traveled all this way." It was not an invitation. It was a decision. Her house, her terms. Charles came in with his 2 lawyers. Edmund followed, glancing around the inside of the cabin with an expression he tried to make neutral and failed. Edmund Prescott had grown up in a house with 15 rooms and a greenhouse and a cook who prepared separate menus for Tuesday dinner parties. The bare walls and the cast-iron stove and the rough table registered on his face like small involuntary winces. Victoria noticed. She said nothing. Luke pulled out a chair at the table and sat in it the way a man sits in his own kitchen, unhurried, unimpressed, taking up exactly the space he was entitled to. Victoria stood beside the stove. She did not offer coffee. She had considered it and decided against it, because offering coffee was a gesture of hospitality, and she was not feeling hospitable. Charles sat down across from Luke and folded his hands on the table and looked at his son-in-law. "I assume my daughter knows," Charles said. "Knows what specifically?" Luke said. "Don't do that. You're too intelligent for it, and so am I." Charles unfolded his hands. "She knows who you are. She knows about your father. She knows why you're sitting on that water corridor like a man who has been waiting." "I've been ranching," Luke said. "The land came with the ranch." "Lucas." "Mr. Langley." Charles breathed in slowly through his nose. "I am willing to offer you a fair price. More than fair. The land is valuable, and I am prepared to pay what it is worth. It's not for sale. Everything is for sale. It's simply a matter of finding the right number." "Then we're done," Luke said, "because there isn't one." Charles looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. "You've convinced her to stand against me. Well done. That's a more elegant approach than your father's." Victoria said, "Nobody convinced me of anything." "Victoria, I am speaking." Her voice came out with a steadiness that surprised even her. "You came here for the water corridor. You've been buying the parcels around it for months through proxy companies before the rail announcement goes public. That's what you do. That is what you did to Jonathan Whitmore, which is why his son is sitting at this table and why you are looking at him like a man never seen on his face before. It was not anger. It was not dismissal. It was the expression of a man who has just recalibrated something fundamentally. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty by half a degree, and they both heard it. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Victoria said. "And so do you." Charles turned back to Luke. The smile was completely gone now. What was underneath it was harder and colder and more honest. "What do you want, Lucas? Acknowledgement? An apology for your father? Money, name it." "I want you to leave this valley," Luke said. "That's not going to happen." "Then we have nothing to discuss." Charles stood. His lawyers stood with him, the instinctive choreography of men who had spent years reading when their employer was done with a room. "I'll be at the hotel in town for 3 days. I strongly suggest you reconsider." He looked at Victoria. "Both of you." He walked out. Edmund lingered for exactly 1 moment too long, looking at Victoria with an expression that was half apology and half the residual assumption that she might still somehow be retrievable. "Victoria," he said, "I hope you understand that your father's concern is genuinely—" "Edmund," she said, "go." He went. The door closed. Victoria and Luke stood in the silence of their own kitchen and listened to the horses leave the yard. Then Luke said, "He's not going to wait 3 days." "I know," Victoria said. "He said 3 days, so we'd spend the next 72 hours debating whether to negotiate. He'll move on the other ranchers tomorrow." Luke looked at her. "The other ranchers?" "He doesn't need your land if he can make your land worthless. If he buys agreements from everyone else in the valley, freight contracts, grazing rights, water access, then your corridor becomes an island. Valuable to you, useless to anyone else. He'll wait you out." She paused. "It's exactly what he did to the Mercer timber interests in 43. He didn't buy them out. He bought everyone around them until they had no market to sell to." Luke was quiet for a moment. "You know his methods well. I grew up watching them." She moved to the table and sat down. "Which means I know exactly where they fail." He sat across from her. "Tell me." "His approach depends on speed and isolation. He moves fast, he keeps the targets separate from each other, and he makes each person feel like they're the only one facing the decision. If the ranchers in this valley talk to each other, if they compare what's being offered, if they understand what's actually happening, the whole strategy collapses." She looked at him. "They trust you. Every man in this valley comes to you when they need a straight answer about land and law and water rights. They trust you more than they trust any lawyer or buyer who rides in from the east. They trust the ranch hand version of me," Luke said, "not Lucas Whitmore." "Then tell them." Victoria said it plainly without drama. "Tell them who you are, all of it. If they find out from my father first, it becomes a weapon. If they hear it from you, it becomes context. Luke looked at the table. His jaw worked slightly. She could see the weight of it, the years of deliberate anonymity, the careful construction of a life that did not require him to be anyone's son, anyone's heir, anyone's symbol of anything except a man who worked his own land. That's a lot to give up, he said. I know, Victoria said. I know it is. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not to comfort exactly, more to anchor. But Luke, you can't fight my father's version of who you are while hiding your own. He will use the secrecy as the story. He will tell every rancher in this valley that Lucas Whitmore came here with a hidden agenda, that he set up this entire arrangement to position himself, that nothing about you is what it appears to be. And he will do it before you can respond. Luke turned his hand over beneath hers. I brought you into this, he said. You brought me somewhere real, she said. That's different. She squeezed his hand once and let go. Ride to Connell tonight, then the Pharaohs, then Hanson and the McReady brothers. Get them all together tomorrow morning. And you, Victoria was already standing. I need to look at those deed records you showed me, all of them. And I need paper and time and quiet. Luke watched her move to the shelf where she kept her journal and her writing supplies. What are you looking for? He asked. She pulled the deed records he had assembled over the past week, the proxy purchases, the transfer dates, the company names, and spread them across the table. A pattern, she said. My father always leaves a pattern. He cannot help it. He is a systematic man, and systematic men cannot stop being systematic even when they should. He will have purchased these properties in an order that reveals the rail route before any announcement. And that order, she smoothed the papers flat. That order is going to tell us exactly what he's planning and when he needs to move. Luke looked at the papers, then at his wife. You're going to outmaneuver him, he said. I'm going to try. She looked up. Go get the ranchers. He went. She worked through the night. She had a lamp, the deed records, a pen, and the particular focused stillness that she had discovered in herself, somewhere between the third week of blistered hands and the first successful loaf of bread. The knowledge that she was capable of learning things she had not been born knowing if she simply refused to stop before the understanding arrived. The deed records told a story when she laid them in order by date. The first purchases had been made 8 months ago. Small parcels along the eastern ridge. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would attract attention. Then 4 months ago, a cluster of acquisitions along the creek bottom north of the valley. Then the southern grazing land. Then 3 properties along the main access road into the valley. She drew the map from memory, the way Luke had described it to her. She placed each purchase on the map in order of acquisition date. The pattern emerged like a shape seen in water. Once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Her father had been building a ring. Not buying along the rail route, building around it. He had been systematically acquiring every piece of land that controlled access to and from the valley before touching the corridor itself. When the ring was complete, whoever owned the water corridor would have the most valuable land in the territory and no way to use it without going through Charles Langley. But the ring was not complete. She looked at the map, looked again. I was missing 2 parcels. The Hanson land to the northeast and the McReady brothers' grazing lease on the western approach. Without those 2 pieces, the ring had gaps large enough to route a small freight operation around his controlled land, which meant the corridor was still genuinely useful to whoever held it, which meant her father needed those 2 parcels, urgently, which meant he had not yet approached the Hanson or McReady families, or he had, and they had not yet agreed, and he was in Black Pine right now, precisely because he needed to close those last 2 gaps before Luke had time to organize resistance. She was still writing when the morning light came through the crooked curtains. Luke came back just after sunrise. He had ridden through the dark to 3 ranches and back, and he looked like it, but his eyes were alert with the particular energy of a man who has spent a night doing something that mattered. They'll come, he said. All of them. McReady brothers, too. Good. Victoria handed him the map she had drawn. Because your visitor last night wasn't just making conversation about 3 days. He needs the Hanson property and the McReady grazing lease within 48 hours, or his land ring doesn't close. After that, he loses the leverage entirely. Luke looked at the map, looked at the dates she had written, looked at the gaps she had circled. "How did you work this out?" he said. "He taught me to think this way," Victoria said. "He just assumed I'd never use it against him." Luke handed back the map. "What do we tell the McReadys?" he said. "The truth. That someone has been purchasing the land around theirs, that within 48 hours they are going to receive an offer, and that if they sign it without understanding the full picture, they will have handed a single Eastern investor control of this valley's access to the railway." She folded the map. "And that they have other options." "What other options?" "A cooperative," Victoria said. "The ranchers pool their deeds as collateral. They go to the territorial land office together as a single entity with a collective claim to the corridor access. My father can't buy them all out individually if they're legally consolidated. It's more complex, but it's real, and it's solid, and—" She stopped. Luke was looking at her. "What?" she said. "I drew up a cooperative land agreement 2 years ago," he said slowly. "Never used it. I put it in the file because I thought the valley might need it eventually." He paused. "I just never thought I'd be the reason it was necessary." Victoria looked at him. "Where is it?" He crossed to the trunk beside the door and opened it. From the bottom, beneath a layer of documents and folded papers, he pulled a leather folder she had never seen. He set it on the table and opened it. The document inside was 20 pages. Careful, precise, legally correct, the work of a Harvard-trained mind that had spent years reading territorial law and federal land compacts and knew exactly how to build something that would stand up in a territorial court. Victoria read the first page, then the second. "This is good," she said. "It should be. Took me 3 months to write it." "You wrote this before I arrived. I wrote it when I heard the first rumors about the rail spur. 8 months ago." He looked at her steadily. "I told you. I came here to get away from this kind of fight. But getting away from something doesn't mean it doesn't find you." Victoria set the document down. "You were preparing for this alone," she said. "I was." "You could have handled it alone." "Probably," he said. "But—" He stopped. "But what?" He looked at the table, at the map she had drawn in the night while he was writing to ranches, at the pattern she had found in the deed records that he had collected, but had not thought to sequence by date. "But alone I would have fought it like a legal problem," he said. "You fought it like a family problem, and that's different because your father isn't a stranger with a scheme. He's a man who knows exactly how to make his own daughter doubt herself, and I—" He stopped again, something working behind his eyes. "I couldn't have anticipated that. I couldn't have countered it." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "He's going to try," she said. "When this comes to a head, he's going to look at me and say everything he has always said, that I'm acting emotionally, that I don't understand what I'm looking at, that I've been manipulated by a man with a grudge." She paused. "He's going to be very calm about it." "And," Luke said. "And I'm going to be calmer," Victoria said, "because I have the deed records and the dates and the map and a 20-page cooperative agreement that I didn't write, but that I am going to present, because standing up in front of my father and speaking clearly is something I have been practicing since I was 17 years old, and I am significantly better at it now than I was then." Luke said nothing for a moment. Then, "When Connell and the others get here, I need to tell them who I am. Yes. It might change how they see me." "It might," Victoria agreed. "Or it might make them understand that the man they've been trusting to read water compacts and settle fence line disputes has been doing it with considerably more knowledge than they realized, and that the knowledge is about to be very useful." She met his eyes. "Let them decide. You keep making their decisions for them, and you'll be no different from my father." Luke absorbed that. "Fair," he said quietly. 6 ranchers arrived at the Barrett place by mid-morning. Connell, the 2 Farrow brothers, Hanson, the McReady brothers, and a 7th man named Olson, who had heard from Hanson and ridden over uninvited, because, as he said without apology, anything that affected the valley affected him too. They stood in the yard and in the kitchen, and Luke stood before them and told them everything. His real name, his father, the history with Charles Langley, the water corridor, why he had come to Montana, and what had followed him. The room was very quiet while he talked. When he finished, James Connell, who had known Luke Barrett for 3 years and trusted him with fence line disputes and water rights and the kinds of neighbor problems that require an honest man, looked at him for a long moment and said, "So you're some kind of railroad lawyer who went cowboy." "Former law student," Luke said. "Current rancher. And you've been reading those compacts all these years because you knew this might happen." "Because I thought it might. Yes." Connell looked at the other men, then back at Luke. "Does that change the water compact you quoted at me 2 seasons back?" "No," Luke said. "The law is still the law." "Does it change the fence line ruling?" "No." "Then I don't see what it changes," Connell said. He looked around at the other men again, the particular look of a man taking an informal poll. "Do any of you see what it changes?" Nobody said they did. It was not dramatic. It was not a speech or a declaration. It was simply 7 working men in a ranch yard deciding that the relevant fact was not who a man had been born, but whether what he told them was true, and 3 years of experience had told them it was. Victoria, standing near the door, felt something loosen in her chest. She unfolded the map and spread it on the table. She walked the ranchers through the purchase pattern. She showed them the dates. She showed them the gaps, the Hanson land, the McReady lease. She explained what closing those gaps would mean. Hanson's face darkened when he understood. "Somebody came to me 2 weeks ago," he said. "Lawyer type. Offered me a number for the Northeast 40. I said I'd think about it." "Don't sign anything," Victoria said. "Not yet. Look at this first." She put the cooperative agreement on the table. "This is a legal mechanism that pools your interests as a single entity. Combined, you have enough collateral and enough collective claim on the water corridor that a federal land office has to treat you as a primary stakeholder in the rail negotiations. One investor cannot buy you out individually because you are not legally individual sellers anymore." The McReady brothers looked at each other. The older one said, "That legal. Completely," Luke said. "I can walk you through every clause." "Who drew it up?" "I did." The older McReady looked at him. "The lawyer Cowboy." "Former law student," Luke said again. Something almost like a smile moved through the room. They spent 2 hours going through the agreement. Luke answered every question with the clarity of a man who had written every word and understood the intention behind each one. Victoria filled the gaps where the practical ranch implications needed explaining, how the collective title would work, what the ranchers' individual rights remained, what they were and were not agreeing to. At the end of it, Connell picked up the pen. He signed. The others followed. Last was Hanson, who had paused longest and asked the most questions and understood the most of what he was signing. He put his name at the bottom of the page and then looked up at Victoria. "Your father's a dangerous man," he said. "You sure about this?" "Yes," Victoria said. "He's going to be angry." "He is already angry," she said. "He was angry when he got off that train. The difference now is that he is going to be angry and wrong, which is a position my father has very little experience managing." Hanson looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, the slow, considering nod of a man making a final assessment. "All right then," he said. The territorial land office in the county seat was a day's ride. Luke and Connell left that afternoon with the signed cooperative agreement riding hard. Victoria stayed because someone needed to stay, and because she understood that the next move from her father's camp would come tonight or tomorrow morning, and she needed to be here when it did. She was right. Edmund Prescott arrived at the ranch just before dark. Not her father. Edmund alone, without lawyers, without hired men, which told her immediately that this was not an official visit. This was her father sending someone he thought she might be softer with, which was such a profoundly mistaken calculation that it would have been funny if the stakes weren't what they were. Edmund got down from his horse and came to the porch. "Victoria," he said, "your father is genuinely worried about you." "My father is worried about the water corridor," she said. "He sent you because he thought I might be more receptive to a familiar face." Edmund had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable. He wants to understand why you're doing this. He does understand, Victoria said. That's why he's worried. You're going to embarrass him. He has already embarrassed himself. I'm simply going to make sure there's a public record of it. She looked at Edmund steadily. Is that what he asked you to say? That I would embarrass him? He said. Edmund stopped. He looked at the cabin behind her, at the crooked curtains visible through the window, at the working ranch in the early dark that was so different from the Boston parlors where he had been formed. Something moved through his face, not quite shame, but something adjacent to it. He said, you've made a mistake, and there's still time to correct it. What mistake? She said. Marrying Luke. Getting involved in something that what? That affects my home, my neighbors, the valley where I live. She held his gaze. Edmund, whose house did you grow up in? He blinked. What? Your house. Growing up. How many rooms? I don't see. How many? 16, he said. Why Did you know the people who built it? Of course not. Did you know what they were paid? Victoria, I genuinely don't understand. I know, she said. I know you don't. And 6 months ago I didn't either, and I am not saying that to shame you because that's not the point. She looked at him quietly. The point is that I live here now. These are real people with real land and real livelihoods and a real future that my father is in the process of making smaller for his own benefit. And I cannot know that and do nothing. I am not capable of it. She paused. I haven't been capable of it since I was 17, and I said so in a room full of men who wished I would stop. Edmund looked at her for a long time. He won't stop, Edmund said finally. Your father, he doesn't stop. I know. What he'll do at the public hearing. I know that too. Edmund mounted his horse. He looked down at her from the saddle, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was not the pleasant empty polish of the man she had been prepared to marry. Something genuine and slightly lost, the expression of someone who has reached the edge of his familiar world and found it was smaller than he thought. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're... He stopped, reconsidered. I think Luke Barrett is a lucky man. He rode back toward town. Victoria stood on the porch in the dark and listened to the hoofbeats fade. She went inside. She sat at the table where the lamp was burning and the deed records were still spread across the surface. She thought about her father in the hotel, about Luke riding through the night to file a document that would change the shape of this fight, about 7 men who had signed their names to something they might not have signed if she had not found the pattern in the dates. She thought about a room in Boston, and a widow and a man at the back of the room watching a 17-year-old girl refuse to sit down. She had not known that night that anyone was watching. She had not done it to be watched. She had done it because something wrong was happening, and she could not keep quiet when something wrong was happening, and that had not changed in 8 years, and it was not going to change now. Luke came back the following afternoon. He tied his horse and walked into the yard, and she came out to meet him and looked at his face to read the verdict before he spoke. He said, filed and recorded. The cooperative is a legal entity as of this morning. The land office clerk was very interested in the purchase date pattern you identified. Interested how? Interested enough to contact the territorial commissioner's office. Luke paused. There's going to be a public hearing on the proposed rail corridor and the land claims around it. 3 days. Victoria breathed. My father will have his lawyers ready, she said. So will we, Luke said. She looked at him. He was dusty from the road, tired carrying the particular weight of a man who had ridden 40 miles on 4 hours of sleep to file a document that might protect everyone he cared about. He looked back at her. She said, You're going to have to stand up at that hearing and be Lucas Whitmore. I know. In front of the whole valley. In front of my father. In front of whatever territorial officials show up. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked out at the valley. The land he had kept. The place he had built. The ward he had spent years constructing between himself and the name he had been born with. No, he said honestly. But I'm going to do it anyway. Victoria looked at him. Then we do it together, she said. He turned to look at her. The afternoon light was on his face, and he was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first morning when she had stood in the kitchen with his coffee, with that particular focused attention of a man filing something carefully for permanent reference. He said, "You already made one decision for me. Don't make another." She recognized her own words, the ones she had said to him when he had moved to stop her. She almost smiled. "Tell me what you need," he said. And those were her words too, turned around and given back to her. She understood standing in that yard that he had been listening to everything she said from the beginning. Not just hearing. Listening the way he read water compacts and Shakespeare with the complete attention of someone who understands that the details matter. "I need you to stand next to me at that hearing," she said. "And I need you to let me speak first." "All right. And I need you to trust that I know my father better than any lawyer you could put in that room." "I already do," he said. The 3 days before the public hearing were the longest of Victoria's life, and also in a way she had not expected the most clarifying. Her father did not come to the ranch again. He worked through intermediaries, a letter delivered by one of his lawyers. Another visit from Edmund. A carefully worded message sent through the general store, each one designed to offer her a version of the situation in which she stepped back, in which she allowed the adults in the room to handle the business, in which she returned to being Charles Langley's daughter in the way he needed her to be. She answered none of them. Instead, she prepared. She knew her father's arguments the way she knew his handwriting. She had heard versions of them her entire life. She understood how he framed a legal irregularity as a misunderstanding, how he positioned himself as a man, bringing progress and opportunity to people. Too limited to see it, how he used the language of benefit jobs, freight access, economic growth to coat decisions that were fundamentally about one man's control. She wrote out every argument he would make. Then she wrote the response to each one. Then she gave the pages to Luke, and he went through them and added the legal specifics she had not had the training to supply. And what emerged from that collaboration was something neither of them could have built alone. The night before the hearing, they sat at the table long after the lamp should have been put out. Luke said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, it will go well," Victoria said. "You don't know that." "No," she agreed. "But I know I've done everything I know how to do, and that's the most anyone can say before a fight." She looked at him. "Are you afraid?" He considered the question honestly. "Of losing the land, no." He paused. "Of what he'll say about you." She was quiet for a moment. "He'll say I've been influenced," she said. "He'll say I don't understand what I'm involved in. He'll look at me across that room with the same expression he's always used when I said something inconvenient, and he'll say in the most reasonable voice possible that his daughter means well, but doesn't have the full picture. And I'll have the full picture," Victoria said. "Laid out in front of every person in that room, in the order the deeds were purchased, with the dates, with the company names, with the gaps around the Hanson and McReady land." She looked at Luke. "He taught me to read a land record. He taught me to follow the money. He taught me to look for the pattern before I made a move." She paused. "He was a very thorough teacher." Luke looked at her. Then he said very quietly, "I should have told you the truth the day you arrived." "Yes," she said. "I was afraid you'd leave." "I know." "Were you if I had told you that day?" "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "Maybe. I was very frightened when I arrived, and I was holding myself together with nothing but determination, and the truth might have been one thing too many." She held his gaze. "But I had the right to it anyway." "Yes," he said. "You did." The honesty between them had become a different thing since the night he had told her everything. Not easier exactly, honesty rarely made things easier, but more solid. The kind of thing that could be stood on when everything else was uncertain. She reached across the table and put the deed records into a single ordered stack. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow I'm going to need you to be very calm because I am going to be somewhat alarming." The right corner of his mouth moved. "I'll be calm," he said. She stood. She picked up the lamp. She looked at him sitting there at the table of the ranch he had built from a deliberate choice to become only what he had made with his own hands, and she thought about a matrimonial advertisement in a newspaper and a letter she had written before she could reconsider, and she thought about how the smallest and most impulsive choices sometimes turned out to contain the largest and most necessary things. "Luke," she said. He looked up. "I'm glad I came," she said, "for what it's worth, even with all of it." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. She went to bed. He sat at the table a while longer in the quiet of the ranch in the Montana dark, with the cooperative agreement filed, and the hearing one day away, and everything about to become either the thing he had spent years building toward, or the thing that cost him what he valued most. And for the first time in a very long time, Lucas Barrett Whitmore did not feel like a man sitting alone behind a wall. He felt like a man standing beside someone. That was enough to sleep on. The hearing was held in the Black Pine Valley Church because it was the only building large enough to hold what had come. The territorial commissioner had sent 2 officials from the land office, which told Victoria that the purchase pattern she had documented had landed with more weight than she had hoped for. Her father's lawyers had arrived with a crate of documents. The ranchers came in their work clothes, which was not a statement, but simply who they were, and they filled the pews on one side of the room with the particular quiet of men who did not make noise before they had to. Victoria sat in the front row. Luke sat beside her. Charles Langley sat across the aisle with his lawyers arranged around him like a wall he had paid for. Edmund was there too slightly behind in the careful position of a man who had not yet decided which way he would lean when the weight shifted. The commissioner's official, a thin man named Garrett, who wore his authority in the precise way he held his pen, called the hearing to order and explained its purpose in the dry procedural language of someone who had done this many times and intended to get through it correctly. The question before the hearing was the legitimacy of land claims surrounding the proposed Northern Rail Corridor, and whether those claims had been made in compliance with territorial disclosure requirements. Charles Langley's lead lawyer spoke first. He was good. Victoria had expected that. He was the kind of lawyer her father always hired, articulate, unhurried, confident, in the particular way of a man who has won most of the rooms he has entered. He laid out the Langley land purchases as straightforward investment decisions, legal in every respect, made in anticipation of regional development that would benefit the entire valley. He used the word opportunity 4 times in the first 10 minutes. He used the word progress 3 times. He did not once use the words proxy company pre-disclosure or corridor monopoly, which were the only words that actually mattered. When he finished, Garrett looked across the room. "Is there a response from the rancher cooperative?" Victoria stood up. She heard her father exhale. It was a very controlled sound, the breath of a man absorbing an outcome he had anticipated but had hoped might not materialize. She said, "My name is Victoria Langley Barrett. I am a member of the Black Pine Valley Rancher Cooperative, and I would like to submit a record of land purchases for the board's review." She walked to the front table and laid down the deed records, ordered by date, with the company names annotated in her handwriting beside each entry. The purchase map she had drawn was folded inside. She unfolded it. She had practiced this. Not the words exactly she had learned from her father, that over-rehearsed words sounded like over-rehearsed words, and that the most effective thing she could do was understand her material so completely that the words came from the understanding rather than from memory. "The purchases began 8 months ago," she said. "This is the first acquisition, a parcel on the Eastern Ridge, purchased through a company called Meridian Land Holdings. Meridian Land Holdings is incorporated in Delaware. Its beneficial owner, as recorded with the Delaware Secretary of State's office, is a holding company called Langley Northern Investment Trust." She paused. "Which is owned by my father." She heard the room shift. Not noise. Just the particular movement of air that happens when a group of people simultaneously understand something they had not understood before. "The second purchase came 6 weeks later," she continued. "A different company name, the same ownership chain." She pointed to the map. "Here, and here, and here. 8 months of acquisitions, each through a separate company, each ultimately traceable to the same investor. None of them disclosed to the Territorial Land Office as related purchases, which is required under the Territorial Land Disclosure Act of 1879, when a single investor acquires more than 3 adjacent parcels in the same region within a calendar year. Garrett was writing. His colleague was writing. Charles Langley's lawyer had stopped looking relaxed. "The purchases form a ring," Victoria said. She put her finger on the map and traced it: the eastern ridge, the creek bottom, the southern grazing land, the access road. Every parcel that controls movement into and out of this valley. Every parcel that controls access to and from the water corridor that sits at the center of the proposed rail route. She took her finger off the map. The only gaps in the ring are the Hanson property and the McReady grazing lease, both of which, as Mr. Hanson and the McReady brothers will confirm, received unsolicited purchase offers within the last 2 weeks from a buyer represented by the same lawyer who is sitting in this room today. She looked directly at Charles Langley's lead lawyer. He looked back at her without expression, which was its own kind of expression. She turned back to the commissioner's officials. "The cooperative agreement filed 3 days ago consolidates the interests of 7 valley ranchers, including the water corridor, as a single legal entity. Under territorial law, a consolidated stakeholder entity has primary consultation rights in any rail corridor negotiation affecting their collective land." She picked up the final document from the table, the cooperative agreement, Luke's 20 pages of careful legal architecture. "This is that agreement, filed and recorded." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then Charles Langley's lawyer stood and said in an admirably steady voice that the purchases in question were entirely legal investments made in good faith, and that the disclosure requirements cited by the previous speaker were subject to significant interpretive latitude, and that the cooperative agreement was a recently constructed instrument of questionable standing, and Mr. Commissioner. Luke stood. The room turned. Victoria watched her father's face in the moment that Lucas Barrett Whitmore stood up in the Black Pine Valley Church and addressed a territorial official. She watched Charles Langley look at the man across the aisle and recalibrate everything he had calculated about this situation, because he had known Luke was here, but he had not expected this. Not the calm, not the authority, not the complete absence of the anger or desperation that Charles Langley's strategies depended on finding in an opponent. "My name is Lucas Barrett Whitmore," Luke said. "My father was Jonathan Whitmore. I have a legal background, and I am prepared to address the interpretive latitude claimed for the disclosure requirements." He looked at Garrett. "The 1879 Act does not include interpretive latitude on the definition of related purchases. The language is unambiguous. I can cite the original legislative record if that would assist the board." Garrett said, "Please." Luke cited it, from memory. Precisely the way he quoted water compacts at fence line disputes with the focused accuracy of a man who has read the same text so many times it has become part of the way he thinks. Charles Langley's lawyer sat down halfway through. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was the quiet professional retreat of a man who has realized that the ground he was standing on is significantly less solid than his client led him to believe, and who is now performing the private calculation of how quickly he can create distance between himself and the outcome. When Luke finished, Garrett set his pen down and looked at both sides of the room. "The board will need time to review the submitted records," he said. "We are suspending the rail corridor claims pending a full investigation of the purchase history and disclosure compliance." He looked at Charles Langley. "Mr. Langley, your legal representatives will be notified of the investigation timeline." Charles Langley said nothing. He was looking at Victoria, not with anger. She had expected anger and had prepared for it and had been ready to hold herself steady against it. What she had not prepared for was this, the look of a man seeing his daughter clearly, possibly for the first time, and finding that what he sees is not what he built and not what he planned and not what he thought he had produced, but something else entirely. Something that has nothing to do with him and everything to do with her. She held his gaze. She did not look away. He stood. He said something quiet to his lawyer. He walked toward the door of the church, and as he passed Victoria's row, he stopped and looked at her one more time, and she waited for the thing he would say. The dismissal, the threat, the controlled paternal disappointment she had been hearing her whole life. He said, "Your mother would have found this interesting." Then he walked out. Victoria sat perfectly still for 3 full seconds. Then she breathed. It was not a reconciliation. It was not forgiveness, and it was not capitulation, and it was not the complicated warmth of a father who has finally seen his daughter as a person. It was simply the most honest thing Charles Langley had said to her in years, and she took it for what it was and put it carefully away for later examination. Luke sat back down beside her. He did not say anything. He simply sat close enough that she could feel the solid particular warmth of someone who is present without performing presence, and that was exactly what she needed. Around them, the room was exhaling. The ranchers were talking in low voices. Connell clapped James Farrow on the shoulder. Hanson was shaking McReady's hand. Garrett and his colleague were organizing the submitted documents with the careful efficiency of men who understood they had just taken something significant into custody. Edmund Prescott appeared at Victoria's elbow. She had almost forgotten about Edmund, which told her something about how much of her life she had been spending imagining his opinion. He said, I don't have adequate words for what that was." "That was a land disclosure hearing," Victoria said. "That was considerably more than that." He paused. He was holding his hat in his hands, which she had noticed people did when they were being sincere rather than polished. "Your father's going to regroup. He doesn't stop, Victoria. I've watched him for years. He'll reframe this as a procedural setback, and he'll find another approach." "I know," she said. "But the ring is broken. Without the corridor and without the Hanson and McReady land, he cannot control valley access. He can still invest in the region. He cannot own it." She looked at Edmund steadily. "And the disclosure investigation will be on record, which means any future purchase attempt has to survive scrutiny." Edmund nodded slowly. He looked at Luke. Something passed between the two men that was not quite respect and not quite the opposite. The complicated acknowledgement of two people who had wanted the same thing, and only one of whom had known it in time. He put his hat back on. "For what it's worth," Edmund said to Luke, "she made the right choice." Then he walked out after Charles Langley, and Victoria watched him go, and felt nothing about it, except the clean, simple absence of the life she had not lived. The walk back to the ranch that afternoon was quiet in the way of people who have spent a great deal of energy and are now in the particular calm that comes after. The ranchers rode in small groups talking among themselves. Luke and Victoria walked because their horses were tied at the ranch, and neither of them had thought to bring them into town, which was the kind of practical oversight that happened when you spent 3 days preparing for a confrontation instead of thinking about transportation. Halfway home, Victoria said, "He's going to go back to Boston." "Probably," Luke said. "He'll be angry for a while." "Yes. And then he'll move on to the next thing. That's what he does. He doesn't carry grudges, he considers them inefficient." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what happens with us, as a family." Luke said nothing. "I'm not ready to forgive him," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Not yet. Maybe eventually, but not yet." "You don't have to be ready for anything on anybody else's timeline," Luke said. She looked at him sideways. "Harvard Law School teaches you that," she said. "Montana does," he said. She almost smiled. It was the closest to a joke she had ever heard him make, and she filed it with the Shakespeare reading, and the shelf, and the curtains, and the water compact in the growing collection of things that added up to a person she had not expected and could not imagine not knowing. They reached the ranch in the late afternoon. She went inside. He stayed in the yard a while. She could hear him moving around out there, checking the horses, doing the small end-of-day tasks that he did in the same order every evening, because routine was the architecture of a life that worked. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the table and the shelf and the curtains that still hung 2 inches uneven on the left side. She had not fixed them. In 2 months, she had not fixed them. She had told herself it was because she was busy, because there were more important things, because it was a small matter not worth the attention. She knew it was because she did not want to. The crooked curtains were the truest thing in the room. They were what happened when a man who did not know how to hang curtains noticed that the morning light was waking his wife too early and decided to do something about it with what he had and did not apologize for the imperfection, because the point was not the curtains. She put water on for coffee. Luke came inside. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her standing at the stove, and she turned around, and they looked at each other across the kitchen, in the particular honesty of the end of a very long day, when there is nothing left to perform and nothing left to protect, and all that remains is what is actually true. I owe you an apology, Luke said. A real one. Not the one I gave you when you found out. A real one. Victoria waited. I answered your letter because I believed in you, he said. That part was true, but I also answered it because I wanted to believe that I could build something separate from my name and my family and everything that happened. And you were the first thing in years that felt like it might be real. He paused. I used that. I didn't mean to. But I used your need to escape, and I used your trust. And I told myself I was giving you a fair chance while I was making decisions you hadn't agreed to. That was wrong. Not just the hiding, the whole approach was wrong. Victoria stood very still. I know what that cost you, he continued. To trust this. To come here. To build something here, and then find out that the foundation had a wall in it you didn't know about. He looked at her directly. I'm sorry. For all of it. Not for answering the letter, but for what I hid inside of answering it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the valley had gone to the long evening light that turned everything gold before it went dark, and inside the ranch was exactly what it had always been, rough and plain and functional and real. Victoria said, I accepted your apology 2 months ago. You accepted the partial one. Luke. I wanted to give you the whole one. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I know. She turned back to the stove. I know you did. Sit down. He sat. She poured coffee. She set a cup in front of him and sat across the table, and they drank coffee in the quiet the way they had learned to share quiet. Not as absence, but as a kind of language. The particular fluency of two people who have stopped needing to fill every space and have started to understand what the space itself is saying. After a while, Luke reached inside his coat and put a leather envelope on the table. She looked at it. Open it, he said. She opened it. Inside were documents she had never seen. Deed records, investment accounts, the remaining Whitmore land holdings, the portion he had kept when he sold the larger holdings after his father's death. It was not a small amount. It was considerably more than the modest cattle operation visible from the ranch window suggested. He watched her read through it. No more hidden things, he said. That's everything. Every piece of it. You should know what you're standing in the middle of. She read carefully, the way she read everything with complete attention. When she finished, she put the papers down and aligned their edges and looked at them for a moment. Then she said, If I marry you. He went very still. Properly, she said. Not the mail-order arrangement. Properly as a choice I make with full knowledge. She looked up at him. Who am I marrying? He understood the question. She could see he understood it, not asking about the name or the money, asking the thing underneath both. A rancher, he said, who makes bad curtains. She held his gaze. Anything else? A man who reads too much law and not enough fiction. A pause. Who should have told you the truth the first morning instead of the first crisis? She waited. He looked at the table, the coffee, the deed records she had just folded back into the envelope, the lamp, the shelf he had built from rough wood, all the evidence of a life that had been assembled piece by piece from deliberate choice. A man, he said quietly and with some difficulty, because this was harder than citing territorial water compacts, and he knew it, and she could see that he knew it, who has not wanted anyone to stay in a very long time, who wanted you to stay from the first morning, and could not say so, because the first morning it would have been asking you to stay for him, and he needed it to be your choice. He met her eyes. A man who is asking you now, properly, because it's your choice, and it always should have been, and I want you to make it knowing everything. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Ask me properly. He did. Not as Lucas Whitmore. Not as the heir to anything. Not as the mystery in a matrimonial advertisement. Just Luke sitting at a kitchen table in Montana with cold coffee and crooked curtains, and his whole honest self visible for the first time. She said yes. They married at the Valley Church on a Saturday morning in October, with the 7 ranchers and their families as witnesses, and Mrs. Connell, who cried efficiently and without apology, and a minister who had lived in Black Pine Valley long enough to understand that the things worth celebrating were usually the things that had been hard-won. Luke stood at the front of the church in a clean shirt and his second-best hat, and looked at Victoria walking toward him, and looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the complete focused attention of a man who has found something worth paying attention to and intends to keep doing it. She wore the blue dress she had brought from Boston. Not to honor Boston, because she had chosen it, and the choosing was the point. The ceremony was short and plain and entirely real. After standing outside the church in the October light, with the valley spread around them, and the mountains at the edge of it, and the whole enormous indifferent beauty of Montana, doing nothing to accommodate the importance of the moment and not needing to, Connell shook Luke's hand and said, "Lucas Barrett Whitmore. That's some kind of name." Luke said, "It is." "Which part do you go by?" Luke looked at Victoria. She looked back at him. "Luke," he said. "Just Luke." Connell nodded. "Fair enough." The territorial investigation concluded 7 weeks later. 3 of Charles Langley's proxy purchase contracts were invalidated for disclosure violations. The remaining parcels he had acquired were permitted to stand, but were flagged in the land office records, which meant any future development required cooperative stakeholder consultation, which meant the Valley Ranchers had a legal seat at every table where their land was discussed. The Northern Rail Spur was eventually built. Not where Charles Langley had planned it. The route was adjusted to reflect the corridor access agreement negotiated with the cooperative, which meant the freight rates were collectively bargained rather than dictated by a single investor who controlled the water. Every rancher in the valley had access. No single buyer could lock them out. Victoria received 1 letter from her father in November. It was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was about business matters unrelated to Montana. The second paragraph said that he had spoken to her mother, who sent her love, and that the piano in the parlor had not been played since Victoria left, and that he found this annoying. It was the closest Charles Langley had ever come to saying he missed someone. She wrote back, not forgiving, not reconciling, but writing because closing the door completely was a decision she was not ready to make, and was not sure she ever would be, and because whatever her father was or was not, he was also the man who had taught her to read a land record and follow a pattern, and that had mattered today in ways he could not have predicted and probably would not have intended. She was working on what that meant. The winter came hard and early, the way Montana winters always came, without apology and without delay, filling the valley with snow and cold, and the long dark evenings that pushed people toward lamplight and warmth. Victoria learned to love those evenings. She and Luke sat at the table after supper, both reading, sometimes talking, sometimes not, in the fluent quiet they had built together out of all the difficult and true things they had learned to say. She had started writing not just journal entries, but longer pieces, the kind of narrative that came from having lived something rather than observed it from a careful distance. She was not sure what she would do with the writing. For now, the writing was enough. Luke finished the agricultural law report he had been reading and picked up the novel she had left on the table, the one she had told him had a dishonest ending. He read the first page, set it down. "The first sentence is wrong," he said. "I know." "Why does anyone finish a book that starts wrong?" "Because you hope it will correct itself," Victoria said without looking up from her own pages. "Does it?" "No." He picked it up again. "Read 3 more pages." Set it back down with the particular finality of a man who has made a decision. "Dishonest ending and a wrong first sentence," he said. "I told you. I should have believed you." "You should believe me about most things," Victoria said. "I'm right more often than you expect." The right corner of his mouth moved. "I'm aware," he said. She looked up then, at the lamp between them, at the shelf he had built from rough wood, at the crooked curtains still hanging 2 inches uneven on the left, because she had decided a long time ago that the most imperfect things in the room were the most honest, and honesty was the thing she had crossed 2,000 miles to find. She looked at Luke. He was already looking at her. This was the thing she had not read about in any book, and had not learned from any lesson, and had not known to look for when she answered a plain advertisement from a stranger in Montana. the particular knowledge of being fully seen by someone who has looked carefully and completely and without requirement. She had fled high society to marry a handsome cowboy. She had found something far more complicated and far more true. She had found a man who made coffee before she woke, who built rough shelves and hung crooked curtains and quoted water compacts from memory, and read Shakespeare in the dark to keep her company through a fever, who had hidden himself behind a wall for years because the world had given him reason to, and who had, when she asked him plainly to stop, stopped. A man who had been born into power and walked away from it, not because power was meaningless, but because the only power worth having was the kind that made other people's lives larger rather than smaller. She had learned who he really was. And what she had learned was this: he was exactly who the crooked curtains said he was, a man who saw what was needed and did something about it with what he had, and did not wait to be perfect before he tried. That was enough. That was it. Turned out everything. Outside, the Montana winter pressed close around the ranch, and inside the lamp burned steady and warm, and Victoria Langley Barrett sat across from the man she had chosen fully. Finally, with every fact on the table and every wall taken down, and understood that freedom was not the absence of difficulty or the escape from complication. Freedom was this: the right to choose with open eyes the life that was worth the work. She had chosen, and she would choose it again every morning for the rest of her life.